It never ceases to surprise me, Japanese game after Japanese game cranking out sexy character after sexy character. Apparently, though, it continues to surprise the West, particularly the US, to no end. Instead of people asking themselves why so many video games seem to have hotter ladies with bigger boobs, they just outright condemn the game and the people behind it so they can feel better about what they understand in their own little world. Well, folks, I think it's time we start asking those why questions. And with the advent of Bayonetta 2 and the bloodletting that's already starting to bring, now is as good a time as any. A lot of people who have lived in or studied Japan would tell you that Japan is an ultra-conservative society that does a heavy amount of sexual shaming, censorship and pornography, the need for establishments for anonymous sex couples, i.e. love hotels, and the general uptightness of Japan are typical guns and ammo these people use. But after spending a decade studying about these people and spending a third of that time living among them in their own country, I'm not so easily convinced. Japan, like the US, strikes me as a country that publicly shames sex and sexual desires. Unlike the US, however, they have a far less strict outlook on the topic when it comes to their media, gag humor, and their personal opinions. Pornography, though publicly censored, is not hidden behind the counter and is actually very easy for minors to get a hold of and start reading in the store. The only thing stopping anyone from picking up a book or DVD that already has explicit material on the cover or the first few pages is a sign that says 18 and over only, which, let's face it, no kid is going to care about. It also wasn't difficult in the slightest to find products for either serious or gag purposes that had explicit sexual references. These things were in the public all the time. This isn't to say that this is a country full of perverts and whores, but rather people who are just more comfortable with sexuality more so than the US, since most of their morality focuses on Eastern religions that focus more on people bettering themselves through actions and practice. Whereas the US, due to its Judeo-Christian influence in the country's early development, has created a mentality that not only shames sex on a public level, but on a private level as well. The family tree of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam put a large importance of marriage before sexual encounters, and the act of engaging in sexual activities before marriage was considered a sin, largely due to the consequences of unwanted pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, etc., etc. Not necessarily a bad rule to follow, but the perversion of this relatively logical and simple idea was taken to the point that many believers recognize sex as being a controversial, uncomfortable topic at best, and a generalized and terrible, terrible sin at worst. This is where the conflict emerges. I do understand that there are plenty of American-made games or other forms of media that take advantage of sex sells in the US, but from an Eastern standpoint, I'm not sure that that's 100% the case, where sexuality and the naked human body is just something that just exists, and is a regular part of life in Japan. It's the difference between over-sexualizing because the creators know that people want it, and the taboo factor will make it sell more, versus the creators knowing it's a sexualized character but not really caring too much because their society has said for hundreds of years now that sex and sexual desire are normal everyday things that shouldn't be looked down on a private setting. In closing, the Sias, Quiets, and Bayonettas of gaming were not, in my mind, created with the malicious intent of disempowering women for the sake of the male market. Heck, I met a lot of 30-something-year-old women who treasured Cutie Honey as being a positive image for women in their life. And if you know anything about Cutie Honey, you might understand from a Western point why that might be perplexing. They are instead products of a country who have long since come to terms about sex and sexuality as a part of humanity that need not be shamed when it comes to one's personal life, so long as it doesn't interfere with health and growth of the public at large. The separation of tatemae and hone, as the Japanese put it. Whether or not that's the way it should be is impossible to determine, since every culture on the planet has its own interpretations of what is morally and legally just. But it's always important to ask the question of why when it comes to the big sociological blow-ups that involve multiple cultures crashing into one another. I think if we spent more time asking why instead of mindless reacting to things that we don't like or understand, we'd get a lot further as a species. I'm Gaijin Goombah, and this totally wasn't a ripoff of movie Bob's The Big Picture.